What if the love you thought was your fairy tale turned out to be a lie? Samira, a young woman swept into the arms of a powerful Arab millionaire, soon discovers a dark secret that shatters her world. Betrayal, deception, and a life built on false promises. Will she survive the fallout? Stay tuned to find out what happens next. Where are you when you're watching this? Will Samira's heart heal, or will the truth destroy everything? The sun had barely risen over Brooklyn, casting a soft glow over the dilapidated buildings that lined the streets. Samira al-Bashir, a 25-year-old driver, stood by the old car, her hands tightening around the steering wheel. Every day felt the same, rushing to work, driving through the busy streets, then coming home to care for her mother, who was sick and growing weaker with each passing day. But Samira didn't mind. She had no choice but to keep going, to push forward for her family. Her life wasn't glamorous, far from it. She had learned to make the most of what little she had. Brooklyn was full of dreams, but dreams didn't pay rent or medical bills. Her mother's hospital visits drained the last of her savings. The reality of her life felt like a heavy weight on her shoulders. Today was different. Today she had a new assignment, driving someone she hadn't met before. A wealthy businessman named Aziz al-Salem had requested her services. She had heard his name whispered among people who worked in high society, a name that was always followed by admiration and a touch of envy. A millionaire, some said. Others, more wary, spoke of him with caution. She didn't care about rumors. To her, he was just another job, another client. As she drove through the streets, her mind wandered, thinking about the fragile hope she had of something more. Maybe, just maybe, this job could lead to a better future. A future where she wasn't fighting every day to make ends meet. But that hope felt distant, like an impossible dream. Samira's car pulled up in front of a towering building. The contrast between her worn vehicle and the shining, polished glass of the skyscraper couldn't have been more stark. She exhaled slowly, stepping out of the car, adjusting her uniform. The building loomed over her, its glass windows reflecting the early morning light. Inside, the lobby was vast and gleaming, filled with marble floors and gold accents. Samira had never been in a place like this before. She felt out of place, like a ghost in a world that didn't belong to her. She tried to steady her breathing, to push back the sense of unease settling in her chest. A man stood by the elevator. Aziz al-Salem, tall, with an air of confidence that seemed to fill the entire room. His presence was overwhelming, his tailored suit making him look even more imposing. His eyes met hers, a quick flash of curiosity before he gave her a polite smile. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was the kind of smile that said he expected her to be exactly what he needed her to be. "Miss al-Bashir, I presume?" Aziz's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like he'd rehearsed his words for this very moment. She nodded, trying to hide the uncertainty in her expression. "Yes, Mr. al-Salem. It's an honor to be driving you today." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside. Aziz pressed the button for the top floor, his hand brushing against the smooth metal with the kind of ease only someone who was used to getting exactly what they wanted could have. Samira stood there, silently, trying to focus on her job. She could feel the tension in the air, a feeling she couldn't quite place. As the elevator ascended, the silence between them felt thick. Samira could see his reflection in the polished steel walls, the way his jaw tightened slightly, as if he was deep in thought. She couldn't help but wonder what someone like him thought about when he wasn't surrounded by people. He glanced at her then, his eyes sharp but assessing, like he was sizing her up. She quickly looked away, unsure of what to make of the way he was studying her. "You've been working in Brooklyn long?" Aziz asked, breaking the silence. His tone was casual, almost like he was making small talk, but there was something more to it, something that felt probing. "Yes," Samira replied, trying to sound calm. "I've been driving for about 2 years now. Keeps me busy." Aziz nodded, his lips curving into a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I see. You must be used to busy lives." There was an underlying meaning in his words, something Samira couldn't place but felt in her bones. It was as if he was speaking about something more than just driving. But she didn't respond to that, keeping her focus on the elevator's smooth ascent. The elevator chimed as they reached the top floor. Aziz stepped out first, his presence commanding the space, and Samira followed him, a few steps behind, still trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping up on her. The door to his office opened with a soft click, and the moment they stepped inside, Samira felt the weight of the world shift. This was a world she didn't know, a world filled with luxury and power, things she had only seen from a distance. Aziz turned to her then, his eyes locking with hers again. For a moment she saw something flicker there, something hidden beneath his calm exterior. He nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Welcome to my world, Miss Al-Bashir." The words felt heavy, loaded with meaning. Samira felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the weight of those words to settle so heavily in her chest. But there was no turning back now. The days passed, and Samira's life, though filled with the same routine, seemed to shift in subtle ways. It wasn't the kind of change she could pinpoint immediately, but she knew something was different. Aziz had been calling more frequently, his voice softer, almost inviting. He wasn't just her employer anymore. He was someone who seemed to want to share bits of his world with her. At first, she thought it was simply part of his charm, something he did with all his employees. But the more they spoke, the more Samira felt like she was becoming a part of his life. And it terrified her. One evening, after another long day of driving through the busy streets of Manhattan, Samira pulled up outside Aziz's penthouse building. The city was alive with its usual hum, but there was an eerie stillness in the air that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Al-Bashir, would you care to join me for dinner?" Aziz's voice crackled through the car's Bluetooth, pulling her out of her thoughts. Dinner? It was an odd request. She was just his driver, not a friend. But there was something in the way he asked, so gentle, so assured, that Samira felt the hesitation she usually had towards him slowly melting away. "Yes," she replied before she could stop herself. She hadn't expected it, but it didn't feel wrong. "I'd be honored." When she entered the building, the scent of freshly cut flowers and polished wood greeted her, the lavish decor familiar now but still astonishing. Aziz stood by the elevator, a slight smile on his lips. He was dressed in a dark suit, his usual formality softened by the warmth in his eyes. It was unsettling how that smile made her feel both welcome and like an outsider at the same time. "Miss Al-Bashir," he said, his voice smooth as ever, but with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite place. "Please join me." As the elevator ascended, Samira's heart beat a little faster. It wasn't just the job. It wasn't just the wealth that made her nervous. It was Aziz. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or something deeper, but something pulled her toward him, and that scared her. They reached the top floor. Samira followed Aziz into his expansive dining room, where an elegant table had been set for two. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of candles casting shadows on the walls. The faint sound of classical music played in the background, adding an almost surreal quality to the evening. Aziz gestured for her to sit. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner. Just the two of us." His tone was casual, but his eyes searched hers, waiting for her to respond. Samira sat, trying not to let the enormity of the moment overwhelm her. She had been to fancy restaurants, yes, but this was different. It wasn't just a place. It was Aziz's world, and for the first time she realized how little she truly knew him. The meal was exquisite. They spoke about trivial things at first, his business, her life in Brooklyn, the weather, but the conversation soon shifted. Samira found herself listening intently, caught between fascination and caution. Aziz seemed to open up in a way that made her both comforted and uneasy. He spoke about his struggles, his loneliness, and the isolation that came with his wealth. "You know," he said, his voice lowering, "people like me often forget what it's like to be part of the world outside these walls, to have real connections, real moments. It's easy to get lost in the luxuries, the business, the fame, but it means nothing when there's no one to share it with." Samira was quiet, taking in his words. There was vulnerability in his confession that she hadn't expected. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Aziz's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke again, his voice now more serious. Samira, I know we don't know each other well, but I feel connected to you in a way that I haven't felt in a long time. The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Was he really saying what she thought he was saying? Samira wasn't sure how to respond. She'd spent her life surviving, making do with what she had, never really letting anyone in. But now, here he was, someone with everything, asking for something deeper. Aziz stood, his hand extended toward her. Samira, he said softly, I want you to be part of my life in a way that goes beyond this arrangement. Will you marry me? The question hung in the air, the silence between them stretching longer than either of them was comfortable with. Samira's heart raced, her mind spinning. The proposal was unexpected, overwhelming. She had no idea how to answer. Was this real? Was he serious? Her eyes searched his, looking for signs of jest, but all she saw was sincerity. This wasn't a business transaction. It was something personal, something raw. Her mind raced with questions. Was she ready for this? Could she trust him? And perhaps most important, did she want to be a part of his world, his dangerous, beautiful world? Samira swallowed hard, her throat dry. She started, but her voice faltered. How could she answer without revealing the doubt and fear that gnawed at her? Aziz's face softened, understanding her hesitation. You don't have to answer now, but I wanted you to know. I want you in my life, more than anything. She sat there, feeling both honored and terrified. She had never imagined her life could take a turn like this. A part of her wanted to say yes, to escape her difficult life and step into his world. But another part of her knew that saying yes could come with consequences she wasn't ready to face. The evening ended with Samira silently agreeing to think about it, to consider everything before making such a life-changing decision. Aziz didn't push her further. He simply took her hand gently, his touch lingering a moment too long. His words were soft, almost reassuring. Take your time, Samira. I'll be here when you're ready. As she left his penthouse that night, Samira couldn't help but wonder how one moment could change so much. She had always known that life was about making choices. But this was different. This choice would alter everything. The day of the wedding arrived with a weight Samira couldn't quite describe. She had spent the night tossing and turning, thoughts of doubt and uncertainty clawing at her mind. The decision had been made, but the reality of it, the gravity of what she was about to do, felt like a storm gathering inside her. The ceremony was set to take place at an extravagant venue in Manhattan, a place she could never have imagined herself entering, let alone standing at the center of. Aziz's words, soft and insistent, echoed in her ears. This is what I want, and I want you with me. The nerves in her stomach twisted tighter as the car approached the venue. The building loomed above her, a towering testament to wealth and power, much like the man who awaited her inside. The doors swung open, revealing a world she knew existed only in dreams. Gleaming marble floors, high ceilings that seemed to touch the sky, and every surface adorned with flowers, gold, and crystal. Samira had dressed carefully for the occasion, a simple yet elegant gown that had been chosen for her by Aziz's assistant. It was beautiful, but it felt like it didn't belong to her. It felt like something borrowed, something she wasn't meant to wear. She adjusted the fabric nervously, looking into the mirror one last time, her reflection staring back at her with wide eyes that screamed uncertainty. Are you ready? The voice of Lena, her best friend, cut through her thoughts. Lena's eyes softened as she looked at Samira, the concern clear in her gaze. You don't have to do this if you're not sure. You know that, right? Samira swallowed, her throat tight. I don't know anymore, Lena. I feel like I'm walking into something I can't control. Lena nodded, her hand resting on Samira's arm. I know, but you're not alone. No matter what happens today, I'm here for you. You don't have to go through this by yourself. Her words were comforting, but they didn't stop the trembling that gripped Samira's hands. The truth was, Samira didn't know what she wanted anymore. She loved Aziz, but did she love him enough to marry him? Was it really love, or was it just the allure of a life she had never dreamed possible? Was she ready to live in his world, with all its luxuries and hidden dangers? The music began, a soft hum that vibrated through the walls of the hall, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. Samira turned to Lena, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'll be okay," Samira whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. Lena smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You will be." As Samira walked down the aisle, every step felt like an eternity. The eyes of the guests were a blur around her, but her focus remained fixed on the man standing at the altar, Aziz. His posture was perfect, his expression unreadable, though there was something in his eyes as they met hers, something she couldn't quite decipher. It was as if he was seeing her for the first time, and the weight of that gaze was almost too much to bear. Aziz looked every bit the billionaire he was, his tuxedo sharp and tailored to perfection. But beneath the polished exterior, there was something else, a depth, a darkness that Samira was only beginning to understand. She wasn't sure if it was love or something else, but the pull between them was undeniable. The officiant's words seemed distant, the ceremony blurring together as Samira tried to hold herself together. She could feel Aziz's eyes on her, and despite the grandness of the occasion, it was the simplest moments that felt most intense. The moment their hands touched, the slight tremor in his fingers as he took her hand. Was it nervousness? Or was it something else? When it came time for her vows, Samira's voice trembled as she spoke, her words caught in the back of her throat. I don't know if I'm ready for this, but I will try. I will try to be what you need." Her words, though true, felt empty even as they left her lips. She didn't know what kind of life this would be, didn't know what kind of future awaited her. But here she was, standing before him, making promises that felt as fragile as glass. Aziz's eyes softened slightly as he spoke his vows, though his words were simple yet profound. "I promise to stand by you, to build a life together, no matter what comes. You are my future, Samira." The final words of the officiant rang through the air. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." And just like that, it was done. Samira stood there, her heart racing, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. She wasn't sure if she was happy, relieved, or terrified. What was this new life, and could she truly belong in it? Aziz took her hand, leading her down the aisle as applause erupted around them. The world felt surreal, as if she were floating in a dream. And yet, despite the joy of the moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly off. She had made a decision, but in the pit of her stomach she wondered if it was the right one. At the reception, the lights were brighter, the laughter louder, the music more celebratory. But for Samira, it felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold before her. People came up to congratulate them, the clinking of champagne glasses sounding like distant noise in her ears. Aziz, ever the gracious host, was the center of attention, speaking with guests, smiling politely, and guiding Samira through the crowd. It was all so overwhelming. But through it all, Samira noticed something in Aziz's eyes, something different. It was more than affection. It was possessiveness, a quiet claim that left her with a chill. As the night wore on, the joy of the wedding felt like a distant memory. Samira smiled and laughed, but inside she was battling the growing discomfort. What had she truly agreed to? The night ended, and as Aziz led her to their car, his arm around her waist, she tried to push away the gnawing feeling in her chest. He kissed her gently on the forehead, but even in the warmth of the gesture, Samira couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into a world that was as dangerous as it was beautiful. The days after the wedding passed like a blur. Samira tried to adjust to her new life, to the world that had opened up to her, the world of luxury, of fine clothes, and even finer dinners. Aziz's presence, his constant watchful gaze, felt like both a blessing and a burden. He was always there, always watching, always expecting, as though his power and wealth demanded her attention, her loyalty, and ultimately her submission. But beneath the surface of their life together, Samira could feel something, an unease she couldn't shake, a sense that everything wasn't as it seemed. It began with small things at first. Aziz would leave early for work, but the moment Samira tried to access his office, his private files, she'd find the door locked or his assistant would be stationed just outside, a constant reminder that she wasn't really a part of his world. And yet, There were moments when he allowed her in, moments when his guard would slip and his mask of cold control would momentarily fade. But even in those moments, there was always something else behind his eyes, a distance, a secrecy that remained unspoken. One evening, after a long day of attending parties and meetings that Samira never quite understood, she came home to find Aziz already in his study, sitting by the window, staring out at the skyline. The city lights twinkled below, but Samira couldn't focus on them. It was him, his posture, his stillness, that drew her attention. She approached slowly, hesitant, unsure if she should interrupt his thoughts. "Aziz?" she called softly, the sound of her voice breaking the silence between them. He turned to her, his eyes unreadable. "Samira," he replied, his voice smooth but distant. "I didn't hear you come in." There was something in the way he said it, something that made her feel as though she had interrupted more than just a quiet moment. He quickly stood up and moved toward her, his usual charm in place. But Samira felt it, the tension in the air, the undercurrent of something hidden. "How was your day?" he asked, his hand brushing against hers as he reached for her. "Fine," she replied, though the word felt hollow. "But I need to ask you something." Aziz paused, his gaze sharpening as he waited for her to continue. Samira hesitated, the question weighing on her like 1,000 bricks pressing down on her chest. Should she ask him? Was she ready to know what she suspected? "What is it, Samira?" Aziz's voice was quieter now, almost gentle, but Samira could sense the subtle warning in it. "I've been going through some of the files," she began, trying to sound calm, but her voice betrayed her. "And I found something strange." Aziz's expression didn't change, but his body tensed. "What do you mean, strange?" She bit her lip, trying to steady herself. "There are some financial records, transactions that don't make sense, large sums of money moving around, offshore accounts." She paused, watching his reaction carefully. "Aziz, what is this? What's going on?" For a moment there was silence between them. Then his smile faltered just a little. "I told you, Samira, my business is complicated. There are things I can't explain to you." She felt the sting of his words, the distance that had crept in once again. But there was more. She had felt the weight of something darker behind his calm demeanor. "I'm not just asking for business reasons," she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't just about money, Aziz. I want to understand what's happening. I want to know who you really are." Aziz's eyes narrowed, and for a brief second the man she had married, who she thought she knew, seemed like a stranger. His expression was calculating, cold, and Samira's heart skipped a beat. He was hiding something, and it wasn't just about money. "You don't need to know everything," he said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening tone. "Not everything is meant for you to know, Samira." The sharpness in his words took her by surprise. She recoiled slightly, but something in her pushed her forward. She had to know. "I saw something else," Samira continued, her heart racing. "There were pictures, old photos of you and a woman, and documents with her name. What is this about? Who is she?" Aziz's face went pale, his jaw clenched, and his fists tightened at his sides. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as though weighing his next move. For a moment he said nothing. Finally he spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "That's a part of my past that I'm not proud of, Samira." A knot formed in Samira's stomach as she waited for him to continue. She needed answers, but every time she asked, he seemed to retreat further into himself. "I was married before," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She disappeared. No one knows where she went." Samira's heart skipped. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and the silence that followed was deafening. She had never heard this before, not from Aziz, not from anyone. The woman in the photos, his first wife, had vanished without a trace. "What happened to her?" Samira asked, her voice almost breaking. "Where did she go?" Aziz's face grew pale, his eyes darting away as if he couldn't bear to meet her gaze. "I don't know. I've never known." Samira stepped back, her mind reeling. The mystery surrounding his first wife, the secrecy, the avoidance of the topic, it was all starting to feel like a web of lies she had just stepped into. What was he hiding? "You're not telling me everything," she said quietly, but firmly. Aziz exhaled sharply, running his fingers through his hair. I can't tell you, Samira. Not yet. You wouldn't understand. There are things I did that I can't take back, and I've been running from it ever since. His voice cracked with the weight of his confession, and Samira felt a mixture of anger and sympathy flood her chest. She had fallen for him, yes, but this was a side of him she had never seen before. It was darker, colder. It felt like betrayal. She stood in silence, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. He had his secrets, dark ones, and they were starting to unravel right in front of her. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension and uncertainty. Samira didn't know what to think anymore. She had believed in him, in their love, but now she wasn't so sure. I need time to think, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Aziz nodded, though there was something almost resigned in his expression. I understand, he said softly. Take all the time you need. But Samira knew the truth now. She was standing at the edge of something much darker than she had ever imagined. And no matter how much time she took, she knew that this was only the beginning of a journey she wasn't sure she could continue. The days after Aziz's admission to his past felt like a fog, thick and suffocating. Samira couldn't shake the weight of what he had told her, the story of his first wife, the woman who had disappeared. And yet the more she tried to push it from her mind, the more it lingered, gnawing at her, raising questions that had no answers. She avoided Aziz, spending more time in the apartment she had once considered a safe haven. She buried herself in work, taking long drives around the city, trying to clear her mind. But each time she returned, it felt like the walls of their life together were closing in on her. Her mind kept circling back to the same thought. What was Aziz hiding? It wasn't until one evening, when she thought she could no longer ignore the whispers of suspicion, that Samira decided to confront him again. The tension between them had reached a breaking point, and she could no longer pretend she wasn't affected by the secrets he had hidden from her. Aziz was in his study when she entered, his back to her as he stared out the window. He looked almost like a stranger in this moment, distant and withdrawn. His usual confident posture had crumbled, and the weight of his past seemed to settle heavily on his shoulders. Aziz, Samira's voice was steady but edged with an emotion she could no longer control. I need you to tell me everything. I can't live like this, not knowing what's real and what's not. Aziz turned slowly, his eyes dark and haunted. He had known this moment was coming, but he had hoped it wouldn't. The secrets, the lies, they had been building for years, and now they were finally demanding to be exposed. What do you want to know, Samira? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. He sounded resigned, as if he had already prepared himself for her questions, but there was a flicker of guilt in his eyes. Samira took a deep breath, the question that had been simmering in her mind now bubbling to the surface. Tell me about her, the woman who disappeared. What really happened? Aziz's face tightened. The tension in the room grew heavier, and for a long moment there was only silence. Samira didn't back down. She couldn't. Aziz walked over to the desk, his hands gripping the edge as though he were holding himself together. Her name was Layla, he said quietly, almost as if saying her name aloud made the memory even more painful. She was my first wife. We were young, too young to understand what we were getting into. Samira's stomach twisted. This wasn't the same story he had told her before. This wasn't the simple explanation of an accidental death. There was more, much more, and she could feel it in the air. Layla was different, Aziz continued, his voice growing distant as if he was lost in the past. She came from a family of influence, a powerful family in the Middle East. But I didn't marry her for her family. I married her because I loved her. He paused, his eyes darkening. But I didn't know who she really was, or what she was hiding from me. Samira stood there, her heart racing. She had never heard him speak about her like this, like a real person, not just a shadow in the corner of his life. The mystery of Layla had always been a blank spot, an uncomfortable silence. Now the pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't add up. What do you mean? What was she hiding? Samira pressed, her voice thick with both fear and curiosity. Aziz looked at her, his gaze searching, as though he were debating whether to share the truth or to bury it once again. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She wasn't who she said she was. She had connections to dangerous people, people I couldn't afford to anger. And when I found out, it was too late. The deeper I went, the more I realized that she had been involved in things I couldn't get out of. Samira felt her pulse quicken. The darkness in Aziz's voice was unlike anything she had ever heard. This wasn't just about a marriage that had gone wrong. This was something much more sinister, something that could destroy everything. "Did you know about it before she disappeared?" Samira asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and dread. Aziz closed his eyes briefly, his face hardening as if the truth had become too painful to bear. "No, I found out too late. Layla had been part of a criminal organization, something bigger than I could ever understand. I tried to distance myself from her, but..." His voice trailed off as if the memories were too much to confront. Samira felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was something far worse. And now, standing here with Aziz, she realized just how deeply she had been dragged into his world, a world she hadn't fully understood until now. "So what happened to her?" Samira asked, her voice shaking. Aziz's expression was unreadable as he turned to face her. "She disappeared. One day she was just gone, no warning, no trace. And I've been trying to bury that part of my life ever since." Samira's mind raced as the weight of his confession sank in. Everything had been a lie. The man she had married, the world she had stepped into. And now, she was part of a story that was far darker than she had ever imagined. "What do you mean by bury it, Aziz?" Samira's voice was barely above a whisper, but the tension in the room made the question feel like a roar. Aziz's face darkened, and he looked away. "I tried to forget about her, about everything, but it's always there. I can't escape it. And now, Samira..." He looked at her with desperation in his eyes. "Now you're involved in all of this. I never wanted you to know." The words hit Samira like a punch. She felt the floor beneath her feet shift, as if the ground had been pulled out from under her. She wasn't just married to a man with a complicated past. She was now trapped in the web of his lies and his secrets. "I didn't sign up for this," Samira whispered, her voice breaking. The weight of it all was too much to take in, too much to understand. Aziz stepped forward, his eyes pleading. "I never wanted to drag you into this, Samira. But now that you know, I'm asking for your trust. I don't want to lose you." Samira looked at him, the man she had thought she knew, and realized that she didn't know him at all. The truth, the dark reality of it all, was staring her in the face. And she had to decide. Could she keep living this lie, or was it time to walk away? The silence between them stretched, suffocating the air. Samira's heart pounded as she absorbed the weight of Aziz's words. She stood there, motionless, as his confession sank in deeper. He had just told her that his first wife, Layla, had disappeared, vanished, under mysterious circumstances linked to something far darker than she could have imagined. But something was off. Aziz had admitted his involvement in criminal dealings, in hiding things, but his story didn't add up. The more she thought about it, the more questions sprang up in her mind. Layla wasn't just a missing person. Her disappearance was tied to something dangerous, something far beyond what Aziz had hinted at. "I can't keep living with this uncertainty," Samira said, her voice sharp with frustration, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "If you want me to trust you, Aziz, I need to know everything. I can't keep walking around with half-truths." Aziz's eyes darkened as he stared at her. "You wouldn't understand," he said, his tone defensive. "Then make me understand," Samira shot back, her voice trembling but determined. "I don't care about your wealth or the luxuries you've given me. I care about the truth. What happened to her, Aziz? What happened to Layla?" Aziz's face turned pale, and for the first time since she met him, Samira saw fear in his eyes. "I told you, Samira, I tried to forget. I tried to leave it behind, but it's never gone. It's always been there." He turned his back to her, and Samira's heart clenched. She had never seen him like this, vulnerable, afraid. He was hiding something bigger than she could have guessed. "Then help me understand," Samira repeated, her voice softer now but still holding the weight of a demand. "Please." Aziz slowly walked to his desk, his hands gripping the edge tightly as though it were the only thing holding him together. His voice was low when he spoke again, but Samira could feel the rawness in it. Layla was involved in something far bigger than I knew at first. There were people, powerful people who controlled everything. Her family had connections to criminal organizations, ones that dealt with money laundering, illegal arms, and worse. When I found out about it, it was already too late. Samira's breath caught in her throat. The words he was saying hit her like a punch, but there was more to the story. She could feel it. "What do you mean, too late?" she asked, struggling to process his confession. Aziz's jaw clenched as he turned to face her again. "She was already involved when I met her. At first I thought she was just a victim, a pawn in something much bigger than her. But as I got closer, I realized she was more than just a pawn. She was a player. And when I tried to distance myself from her, tried to walk away, she disappeared." His words hung in the air like a thick fog. Samira's mind raced, but she couldn't catch her breath. He was telling her that his first wife had been involved in organized crime, that she had been more than just a wife. She had been complicit. And now, the more he spoke, the clearer it became that Layla's disappearance wasn't just a random tragedy. "Did you ever report it? The disappearance?" Samira's voice was barely a whisper. Aziz shook his head slowly, his eyes hardening. "I couldn't. I had too much to lose. My family, my business. If I had said anything, it would have been the end of everything I had built. And so I buried it. I buried her memory, and I pretended like it never happened." Samira felt her heart drop. The man she had married, the man she had believed in, had been hiding not just a secret life, but a dangerous one. Everything she had known about him had been a lie, carefully constructed to protect him, to protect his world. And now she was a part of it too. But there was more. She could sense it. Something else, something deeper, was still hidden beneath the surface. "Aziz," she started, her voice shaking with both anger and fear. "What really happened to her? You keep saying you don't know, but I don't believe you. There's more. I can feel it." Aziz didn't answer immediately. He simply stood there, his face taut with emotion, as if battling an internal war. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, and the weight of his words crushed Samira further. "After she disappeared, I thought it was over. But people came looking for her. They were asking questions, threatening my business. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The last thing I wanted was for you to be dragged into this, Samira. I never wanted you to know about any of this. I thought I could keep you safe, keep you away from all of it." Samira stared at him, her body trembling with the enormity of it all. She had walked into his world, not knowing the dangers that lurked beneath the surface. The facade of a perfect marriage, of a perfect life, was just that, a facade. "I married you because I wanted to leave all of it behind," Aziz continued, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't. I never could." Samira felt the floor beneath her shift. She had known that there were secrets, but this was something darker, more twisted than anything she could have imagined. "So what now?" she asked, her voice cold with realization. "What happens now, Aziz?" Aziz's eyes were filled with regret, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. "Now you need to decide. I can't promise you safety anymore. I can't protect you from what's coming. I didn't want you to be a part of this world, but you already are." The room felt smaller, the air thicker as the truth settled in. Samira felt trapped, suffocated by the web of lies and danger Aziz had pulled her into. The life she had imagined with him, the future she thought they would build together, seemed impossible now. Aziz took a step closer, his hand reaching for hers, but Samira pulled away. She didn't know who he was anymore, and the uncertainty was suffocating. "I didn't sign up for this," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "And I don't know if I can keep going with you like this." Aziz's eyes pleaded with her, his voice soft and desperate. "Samira, I love you, please." But she couldn't hear him. The truth had shattered everything. The man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by someone she wasn't sure she could trust. The truth had been revealed, but in the wake of it, Samira didn't know if there was anything left to save. Samira had always believed that love was supposed to be a safe harbor, a place where you could lay down your fears and feel protected. But now, Standing in the midst of a life she hadn't signed up for, she realized how wrong she had been. Aziz had already shattered so many of her assumptions, and yet the truth of who he really was seemed even darker than she could have imagined. It started with a phone call. It was late at night, and Samira was alone in the apartment. Aziz had been absent for the last 2 days, saying he needed to handle some business. She had assumed it was just another vague excuse, another wall he had built between them. But this time there was something different, something nagging at her. She picked up her phone when it rang, Aziz's name flashing on the screen. She hadn't heard from him all day, and the silence between them had only deepened the distance. "Aziz?" she answered, her voice tentative, still unsure if she even wanted to hear from him. "Samira," he said, his voice strained, almost pleading. "I need you to listen to me. There's something I have to tell you." His words were like ice water pouring over her. She sat up straighter, sensing the urgency in his tone. This wasn't just another one of his excuses. Something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, her stomach tightening with unease. "I never wanted to hurt you, Samira, but I've been keeping something from you. Something I didn't want you to know," Aziz said, his voice trembling. There was a hesitation in his words, something raw that she had never heard from him before. Samira's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about, Aziz?" She could hear him take a deep breath on the other end of the line. Then, finally, he spoke the words that would change everything. "The woman you've been asking about, Layla, she's not gone. She's alive. She's been hiding and she's been in contact with me for months." The revelation hit her like a blow to the chest. Samira felt her breath catch in her throat, her mind racing to process his words. She had suspected something all along, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You've been in contact with her? All this time?" Aziz's voice faltered. "I didn't want to involve you, Samira. I didn't want you to get caught up in this, but it's too late now. Layla, she's been blackmailing me, threatening everything I've built. She wants me to help her, but I'm trying to keep you safe. I never wanted you to know about her." Samira stood up, her body shaking as the truth sank in. The woman he had claimed was gone. The woman whose disappearance had haunted their lives for so long was alive, and she had been manipulating Aziz. The lies he had spun to keep her in the dark suddenly felt like an insidious web, pulling her deeper into something she didn't want to be part of. "So all of this, everything, was a lie?" Samira's voice cracked, the pain in her chest rising to the surface. "You never told me the truth. You used me, Aziz. You've been using me all along." There was a silence on the other end of the line, and Samira could almost hear the weight of his guilt in that silence. When he finally spoke, his words were soft, almost desperate. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to bring you into this. But I couldn't get out. You have to understand, Samira. I was trying to protect you, to keep you safe." "By lying to me? By keeping me in the dark?" Samira's anger flared, the betrayal burning through her. "Do you even know what you've done to me, to us?" She could hear him take a shaky breath. "I'm sorry, Samira, but I can't lose you. I need you to trust me. Please." But Samira's trust had already been shattered, broken beyond repair. The man she thought she knew, the man she had married, was someone else entirely. The world he had promised her, the life they were supposed to build together, was a facade, and she had been nothing more than an accessory in his lies. "I trusted you, Aziz. I believed in you," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "But you've shown me who you really are, and I can't be part of this anymore." There was a pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Aziz said, "Samira, please, don't leave me. I'll do anything. Just stay. We can fix this." His plea was desperate, but Samira was no longer swayed by his promises. She could feel the walls he had built around her, the lies, the manipulations, and the way they had trapped her in a life she never wanted. She had allowed herself to believe in him, in their future, but now the truth was clear. There was no future with him. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped away from the phone. "I can't stay here, not with you, not like this." She ended the call, her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of his betrayal crushed her. Her whole life, everything she had built in this brief, fragile relationship, felt like it was crumbling to dust. But it wasn't just Aziz who had betrayed her, it was herself. She had trusted him, allowed herself to fall into his world, to be pulled into the lies. Samira's hands trembled as she stood there trying to steady herself. She could feel her heart breaking with each passing second, but deep down, she knew that this was the only choice left. She couldn't stay in a world of lies, a world where she wasn't safe, where she wasn't truly loved. As she looked at her phone, the weight of everything settled on her. The life she had imagined, of love and security, of a future with Aziz, was gone. And now Samira was left to pick up the pieces alone in a world she had never fully understood. Samira sat in the dimly lit living room, the silence surrounding her like a thick fog. The phone call had ended hours ago, but the sting of Aziz's betrayal lingered, wrapping itself around her heart. She had tried to breathe through the pain, tried to make sense of the mess he had left behind, but it was impossible. Aziz's words echoed in her mind. I need you to trust me. Trust. It was a word that now felt foreign to her, like a distant memory she could never retrieve. How could she trust him after everything? The lies, the secrets, the woman he had kept hidden from her, the betrayal that had slowly, methodically consumed the space between them. She couldn't stand it anymore. She couldn't live in the fog of uncertainty he had created. She needed answers, clarity, and she needed them now. She stood up, her resolve hardening. If Aziz was going to continue playing games with her, then she would force him to face the truth, to look her in the eye, and tell her everything. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that the life they had built together hadn't already fallen apart. The apartment felt suffocating as she walked toward the door. She didn't even hesitate as she grabbed her coat and headed out, her mind fixed on one goal, to confront him, to make him face the reality of what he had done. When she arrived at his penthouse, the building towered over her like a prison she could never escape from. She didn't know why she was still coming here. Maybe because deep down, a part of her still hoped that everything could be fixed. Maybe, just maybe, they could return to the way they were before the lies had poisoned everything. But she knew, deep in her gut, that it was too late. The damage had already been done. Aziz wasn't home yet. His assistant let her in with a polite smile, though there was a hesitation in her eyes. Samira didn't care. She wasn't here to be polite. She was here for answers. She sat in the same spot she had sat countless times before, but this time it felt different. The grandeur of the apartment, the lavish furniture, the quiet hum of the city outside, they all felt hollow now, like an empty shell that had once contained something real. Now it was just a mask, hiding the rot underneath. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone, dialing his number. It rang 3 times before he answered. Samira. His voice was strained, but there was a note of hope in it. Please, I've been trying to reach you. Her throat tightened as she held the phone to her ear. We need to talk, Aziz. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of his breathing filling the silence. Samira, please, I know you're angry. I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. His apology, the same empty apology he had given her before, felt like salt on an open wound. She wasn't angry anymore. She was past anger. Now she just wanted the truth. You've been lying to me from the start, Aziz. I can't keep living in your world of secrets and lies. Her voice cracked with the weight of her words. I need you to face me. I need you to tell me what's really going on. Please, he said again, but this time there was desperation in his voice. I can explain everything. I just need you to understand. No, Samira interrupted, her voice steady but laced with the bitterness she had been holding in. No more explanations. I need the truth. I want you to tell me everything. No more hiding behind excuses. No more lies. The line went silent for a moment, the tension in the air thick with the unspoken words between them. Finally, Aziz spoke, his voice breaking. I should have told you everything, Samira, but I couldn't. I didn't want to lose you, and I was trying to protect you from all of it. His voice faltered, and she could hear the weight of regret in his words. I never meant for you to get caught up in this, but you're already here, and I need you to understand everything I've done to protect you. Protect me? Samira scoffed, the laughter that escaped her throat, bitter and hollow. By lying to me? By keeping me in the dark? How is that protecting me, Aziz? There was no answer, just a heavy silence. Tell me about Layla, she demanded. Tell me why she's been contacting you. Tell me why you never told me the truth. Aziz let out a slow, shuddering breath. She's been using me, Samira. She's been blackmailing me. She threatened to expose everything we've built, the life I've given you. I had to keep it a secret. For you. For us. His words hit her like a cold slap to the face. The lies, the secrets. It was all coming out now, but none of it made sense. How had she been so blind? How had she trusted him so completely? All this time you've been hiding your past from me, hiding her, and now I'm supposed to just… What? Forgive you? Her voice broke on the last word, the anger and pain spilling out. You've betrayed me, Aziz. I don't know who you are anymore. I know, he whispered, his voice filled with anguish. I've destroyed everything, Samira. I never wanted to hurt you, but I've already hurt you in ways I can't take back. The rawness of his words pierced through her defenses. A part of her wanted to reach out to him to comfort him, but she couldn't. The trust was gone. The bond they had built had been shattered into a million pieces, and nothing he could say would ever fix it. I can't do this anymore, Samira said softly, her words final. I can't be part of your lies. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when I know it's not. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Samira. But she didn't let him finish. She hung up the phone before he could say anything more. The finality of it settled in her chest like a weight she could never escape. She wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something close to clarity. The lies had caught up to her, but now she was free of them. And even though it hurt more than she ever thought possible, Samira knew she couldn't go back. The days following the confrontation with Aziz felt like a blur to Samira. Each morning she woke up with a pounding headache and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. She had left him. No, she had walked away from the man she thought she loved, and it felt like the ground beneath her feet had been ripped away. She tried to carry on with her life, but everything had changed. The once comforting hum of the city, the familiar routines of her days, none of it seemed to matter anymore. She was caught in the aftermath of betrayal, drowning in a sea of regret and confusion. And Aziz? He was no longer the man she had once known. He was a stranger, someone she couldn't recognize, a man whose lies had infected every inch of her life. The phone calls started soon after. First it was Aziz, his voice filled with desperation, pleading for her to come back, promising that he could fix everything. But Samira didn't want to hear it. Each call was a reminder of the darkness he had pulled her into. The promises he made seemed empty now, nothing more than words to placate her, to manipulate her into returning to his world. Samira, please, he would beg over the phone. I know I've made mistakes, but I can change. We can fix this. Just give me another chance. But she had heard it all before. Words were easy to say, easy to promise, but they meant nothing when the actions didn't back them up. She wasn't going to fall for it again. Then the silence settled. Days passed, and Samira could almost taste the isolation. It wasn't just that Aziz had disappeared. It was that his absence had carved a hole in her world, one she wasn't sure how to fill. He had been her anchor, her protector in a world that felt out of control. But now, all she could see was the damage, the lies, and the secrets he had kept from her. One morning, after the ringing phone went unanswered, Samira received a knock on her door. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw who it was. Lena stood there, her face pale, her eyes filled with concern. You haven't been answering your phone, Lena said, her voice tight with worry. I'm getting worried, Samira. You're shutting everyone out. What's going on? Samira stepped back, letting her friend in. She didn't have the energy to hide her emotions anymore. She hadn't realized how much she needed Lena until this moment. I'm just trying to figure it out, Samira said, her voice thick with exhaustion. Everything is falling apart, Lena. I thought I had it all figured out, but now I don't know who I am or what I want anymore. Lena's eyes softened, and she reached for Samira's hand. "You're not alone, Samira. You don't have to figure this out by yourself. You have people who care about you." But Samira wasn't so sure. She felt more alone than she ever had in her life. "I trusted him," Samira whispered, her voice cracking. "I believed in him, and look where it got me." Lena didn't respond right away, but the silence between them spoke volumes. They both knew the truth. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about trust, betrayal, and the painful realization that the life Samira had once dreamed of with Aziz had been nothing more than a mirage. Later that day, Samira decided to confront the truth head-on. She couldn't keep hiding from the fallout of her choices, nor could she keep pretending that everything would just magically get better. She had to take control. She picked up the phone and called the one person who might have the answers she needed, Aziz's lawyer. It felt strange, almost surreal, but she needed to know what had really been going on behind the scenes, the deals, the hidden accounts, the danger that Aziz had tried to keep from her. "Miss Al-Bashir?" The lawyer's voice was cool and detached on the other end of the line. "How can I help you?" "I need to know everything," Samira said, her voice firm despite the unease in her chest. "I need to know the truth about Aziz's business, his dealings, and the people he's been involved with. All of it." There was a long pause. "I'm afraid you don't fully understand the situation, Miss Al-Bashir. It's more complicated than you realize. What you're asking about is sensitive, and I can't release that information without—" "I don't care about the complications," Samira cut in, her voice hard. "I've lived in the dark long enough. I deserve to know everything." The lawyer's sigh was audible on the other end. "Fine, but be warned. What you're about to hear could change everything. It's not just about money, Samira. This is far bigger than that." Her heart raced as the lawyer began to speak, revealing the web of lies, corruption, and criminal activity that had been running beneath the surface of Aziz's empire. Layla, his first wife, had been deeply involved in illegal arms dealings, and Aziz, despite his best efforts to distance himself, had been dragged into the same world. The money laundering, the shady connections, none of it had been accidental. And the worst part, Aziz's business dealings were under investigation by several government agencies, and his name was linked to criminal organizations that could destroy everything he had built. Samira's world tilted. The life she had been living, the life she had been led to believe was stable, protected and filled with promise, was a lie. Everything had been built on secrets and betrayal, and now the truth was out, and there was no way to undo the damage. She sat there in stunned silence after the call ended, her mind reeling. What now? What could she possibly do with all this information? What was left for her in a world that was so clearly broken? Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from Aziz. He had sent her multiple messages over the past few days, each one pleading for forgiveness, for a chance to explain. But this one was different. "I'm sorry, Samira. Please don't do this. You have to know that everything I've done for you. Don't let the past define us." She stared at the message, her hand shaking as she held the phone. She wanted to respond, to tell him everything she had learned, to tell him how much he had hurt her. But in that moment, she realized something. The man she had once trusted was no longer the person she had married. And no matter how much he apologized, no matter how many promises he made, the truth was that it was too late. The fallout was here. And Samira had to make the hardest choice of all, whether to forgive him or to finally walk away, leaving everything behind. The days that followed her decision to leave Aziz felt like walking through a thick, unending fog. Each morning, Samira awoke with a strange sense of emptiness, like something essential had been stolen from her. She had been living in a world where she had trusted everything, a world built on lies, on illusions, and on the manipulation of someone she had loved. Now that it was gone, all she had was the cold, harsh truth and the remnants of a life that no longer made sense. She moved out of the penthouse, packing her things in a few hurried hours, each item she touched feeling like a part of her former self slipping away. She left behind the grandeur, the luxury, the world that had seduced her into believing she could have it all. She left it all behind, even though every part of her was screaming to stay. to believe that somewhere deep down, the man she had married was still there, waiting for her forgiveness. But she couldn't stay. She couldn't go back to a life built on deceit. She needed something new, something that was truly hers, no strings attached, no lies lingering in the shadows. The first few days were a blur of confusion. She moved into a small apartment in a quieter part of the city, away from the chaos of her old life. It was modest, nothing extravagant, but it was hers. For the first time in months, Samira felt like she could breathe again. Her phone had stopped ringing. The constant stream of messages from Aziz had dwindled to nothing. The silence was both a relief and a pang of loneliness. He had been so present in her life, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. Now that he was gone, she realized just how much his absence left a hole in her world. The first few nights in the apartment were the hardest. She lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling as the ghosts of her past whispered through the dark. Aziz's face, his voice, his touch, everything about him still haunted her, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. But she had made her choice. She couldn't go back. As the days went by, she found herself slowly rebuilding, piece by piece. The world outside her door no longer seemed so overwhelming. There was a small cafe she frequented now, where the barista, Jenna, a warm and kind woman, greeted her with a friendly smile every morning. The quiet mornings, the peaceful routine, started to soothe her aching heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. One afternoon, as she sipped a coffee by the window, watching the hustle of the city pass by, Lena walked in. Her familiar face was a welcome sight, and the moment their eyes met, Samira felt a wave of relief. "Hey," Lena said, sitting across from her with a concerned but gentle look in her eyes. "How are you really doing?" Samira didn't have to pretend with Lena. She let out a sigh, feeling the weight of everything she had been holding back. I'm getting there. It's harder than I thought, Lena, but I think I'm going to be okay. I just need time." Lena smiled softly, her eyes understanding. "You're stronger than you think, Samira. You've been through hell, and you're still standing. That's something. You deserve to find your peace." Samira nodded, her fingers wrapping around the warm mug in her hands. "It doesn't feel like peace right now, but I know it will, eventually." In the weeks that followed, Samira began to rebuild her life. She took up a job at a local marketing firm, working with a small team that valued her skills. The work was fulfilling, and for the first time in a long while, Samira felt like she was making something of herself on her own terms. She wasn't just the wife of a powerful man anymore. She was Samira al-Bashir, a woman who had fought through the wreckage of her past to find a future of her own. But even as she found her footing, there were moments when the past threatened to surface. One day she received an envelope from an anonymous sender. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a single photograph, Aziz, standing with a group of men in what looked like a dark, dimly lit room. The faces of the men were familiar, figures she had seen in the background of her life with him, people whose names she didn't know, but whose presence had always been heavy in the air. The photograph was accompanied by a short note. "You're not the only one who wants the truth. Be careful." The words felt like a warning, a reminder that Aziz's world was still lurking in the shadows, and that her departure hadn't ended the danger. But Samira wasn't afraid. She had faced the truth. She had faced her own heartbreak and the lies of the man she once loved. There was nothing left to hide, nothing left to fear. The next day, she threw the photograph away. It was a reminder of a world she had left behind, a world she wasn't going back to. The people in that photograph, Aziz included, no longer had a hold on her. She had chosen to walk away, and walking away meant leaving the past behind. Weeks passed, and Samira continued to heal. She wasn't the same person who had married Aziz. She wasn't the naive woman who had believed in the fairy tale. She had learned that life was far messier than that, and that true strength came from surviving, from finding a way to keep going even when everything around you seemed to crumble. One evening, as she sat by her window watching the sun set over the city, Samira finally felt a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. The scars of the past would always be with her, but they no longer defined her. She had a new life now, one built on her own strength and resilience. And for the first time in a long while, Samira smiled. She had made it through the storm, and now she was free. The sun had barely risen when Samira felt the weight of her decision settle deep into her chest. It had been nearly 3 months since she left Aziz, and while the world around her had started to find a semblance of normality, a question remained unresolved in her heart. Could people like Aziz truly change? Could someone who had been so deeply immersed in lies, manipulation, and darkness ever redeem themselves? The question gnawed at her in the quiet moments, when the noise of the city faded away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She had moved on, she was certain of that. She had built a new life, one free from the suffocating presence of the man she had once loved. Yet there was something about redemption, something that haunted her every time she considered his words. He had begged for forgiveness, promised to change, and most importantly had vowed that his love for her was genuine. Could that have been true, or was it just another manipulation? The phone call came early one morning just as she was finishing her coffee. Her hands froze around the mug when she saw the name on the screen. Aziz. She hadn't heard from him in weeks. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail. But something inside her stirred. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that small broken part of her that still wondered about the man who had been her everything. She answered before she could talk herself out of it. Samira. His voice was soft, almost tentative, as if he were afraid she might hang up at any moment. Please, just hear me out. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to show you I'm not the man I was. Samira's breath caught in her throat. She had braced herself for his usual apologies, but this time his words seemed different, sincere, as though they were coming from someone who had finally understood the cost of his actions. I've hurt you in ways I'll never be able to take back, he continued, his voice strained with emotion. But I've spent every moment since we parted trying to fix the mess I created, not just for me, but for you. I've made choices that put you in harm's way, choices that I can't undo, but I want to be better. Not for anyone else, Samira, but for me. And maybe, just maybe, for you. The rawness in his voice unsettled her. It had been months, and she had moved on. She had built walls high enough to keep the pain at bay. Yet now, in the quiet of her apartment, his voice seemed to find its way through those walls, and she could feel her heart, which she had buried so deep, stir once more. Aziz, she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if you can change. I don't know if I can ever believe in you again. I'm not asking you to believe in me, Samira, he replied urgently. I'm asking you to let me prove it. I want to show you that I'm not just the man you left behind. I want to show you the person I can become, the person I've been fighting to become. Samira closed her eyes, her mind racing. She thought of the man she had married, the man who had been so charming, so loving in the beginning, and yet was hiding a darkness that she had only glimpsed too late. She thought of the promises he had made, the lies he had told. How could she ever trust him again? But then something shifted. A small voice deep inside her whispered that redemption wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about undoing the past. It was about learning from it, owning it, and trying to make it right. I can't promise you anything, Aziz, she said, her voice filled with an emotion she hadn't expected. But I will listen. I will hear you out. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Samira thought he might hang up, retreating into his familiar wall of pride. But then he spoke again, his voice filled with relief. Thank you, Samira, he whispered. Thank you for giving me this chance. The conversation ended shortly after, and Samira sat in silence, trying to process everything he had said. Was she making a mistake? Could Aziz really change, or was this just another ploy to win her back? The next few days were filled with phone calls and meetings. Aziz, as promised, had begun to show Samira the steps he had taken toward redemption. He had cut ties with his former business associates, those shady connections he had relied on for so long. He had started working with a rehabilitation program for those who had been involved in organized crime. He had begun therapy, trying to understand the root of his actions and the damage he had caused. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time in a long time, Samira saw a glimpse of the man he could be, a man who was genuinely trying to fix what he had broken. Over the weeks, they met several times, always in neutral places, always on neutral ground. Samira was cautious. She watched him, listened to him, observed every word, every gesture. She could see the effort, the real work he was doing to change. But trust, she realized, was like glass. Once it was shattered, it was impossible to put back together perfectly. It would always carry the cracks. One evening, as they sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, Aziz looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that shocked Samira. "I know it's not easy, Samira. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I hope someday you can see the man I'm trying to become." Samira met his gaze, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than hurt. She had spent so much time protecting her heart, holding herself back from the possibility of loving again. But in this moment, sitting here with him, she realized that redemption wasn't just about him. It was about her too. It was about healing and learning to forgive herself for ever trusting him in the first place. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you, Aziz," she said softly. "But I'm starting to understand that forgiveness isn't just about what you've done. It's about what I need to let go of too. I'm trying. And that's all we can do, right?" Aziz nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret. "I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes." Samira knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Forgiveness, redemption, these were long, difficult paths. But in this moment, she allowed herself the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for both of them. The silence in Samira's apartment was deafening. It had been weeks since she had last spoken to Aziz in person, but the phone calls, the messages, the small gestures of his continued effort had not stopped. Each time she thought she was beginning to move forward, his words seemed to reach across the space between them, pulling her back. But now, more than ever, she had to face the truth. The decision that had been looming over her like a shadow was finally here. She stood by the window, her gaze drifting over the city below, feeling the weight of it all. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, but it wasn't the reflection she had come to know. It was someone else, someone who had lived through betrayal, someone who had fought to rise above it. And yet here she was, still caught in the aftermath of it all, trying to reconcile the life she had imagined with the life she had been forced to face. Aziz had changed. She could see that. He was different, more genuine, more vulnerable. The man who once hid behind a mask of power and control was now trying to make amends. But could she believe in that change? Could she ever trust him again after everything he had put her through? A knock at the door broke her thoughts, and her heart skipped a beat. She didn't have to look through the peephole to know who it was. She hadn't seen Aziz in person since the day she had left him, but something in her bones told her that this moment had been inevitable. Samira took a deep breath and opened the door. There he stood, looking exactly as he had before. Dark eyes, sharp features, that same air of quiet power that had drawn her to him in the first place. But now, there was something else in his expression, something softer, filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Samira." Aziz's voice was tentative, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside, allowing him in. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a tension that neither of them could escape. Finally, Samira turned to face him, her heart racing with the uncertainty of the moment. "What do you want from me, Aziz?" Her voice was steady, but inside she was torn. "You've been doing everything you can to show me that you've changed. You've shown me who you want to be, but I need to know if it's real, if I can trust you again." Aziz's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't look like the powerful, unapproachable man she had once known. He looked like someone who was finally facing the consequences of his actions, someone who was willing to own up to everything that had gone wrong. "I know I've made mistakes," he began, his voice quieter now. I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But I've spent every moment since you left trying to make things right. Not for you, not for anyone else, but for myself. I know I can't change the past, but I've learned that change starts with facing the truth. Samira's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. This was different. This wasn't the man who had manipulated her, who had promised her the world only to leave her in the dark. This was a man who was finally owning up to his flaws, a man who was willing to face the consequences of his actions. But could she forgive him? I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Aziz, Samira whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I did before. The pain, it's still there. Aziz took a step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't expect you to forgive me, Samira. I don't expect anything from you. But what I want more than anything is the chance to prove to you that I am not the man I was. I want to earn back your trust, if you'll allow me that. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Samira felt the weight of the decision pressed down on her chest. What did forgiveness mean? Was it even possible? Or was she simply clinging to the idea of a future she had imagined, one that was never truly hers to begin with? Aziz's eyes were filled with sincerity, but Samira couldn't ignore the voice inside her, the one that told her she needed to be careful. She had lived a life where trust had been broken so easily, where love had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Could she risk opening her heart to him again? She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the overwhelming urge to walk away. There was something in his gaze, something raw, something honest, that made her want to believe that people could change, that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. But then the truth hit her. The choice wasn't about whether or not she could trust him. It was about whether or not she could trust herself. I've spent so long trying to rebuild my life, Aziz, Samira said, her voice steady, but filled with emotion. I've fought so hard to let go of the past, and now I need to decide if letting you back in is worth the risk. I can't live in the shadows of what you've done. I need to live for myself, for my future. Aziz stood still, watching her with the intensity of someone who knew this moment was pivotal. The silence between them stretched, but neither of them spoke. He knew what was at stake. He had broken her once, and now it was up to him to prove he was worthy of her trust. I understand, Aziz said, his voice quiet but filled with a deep, painful honesty. I can't ask you to forgive me, but I'm here, Samira, and I always will be. I'll wait for as long as it takes for you to make your decision. Samira took a deep breath, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She had come so far, had rebuilt so much of her life, but one thing was still missing: peace. She had spent so much time looking backward, trying to make sense of a past she couldn't change. Now it was time to look forward, to find the future that was truly hers. Aziz, she began, her voice soft but resolute. I need time. I need time to figure out who I am without you in my life. I need to see if I can trust myself before I can trust anyone else. But I promise you this. I'll make my decision. And when I do, you'll know. Aziz nodded, his expression filled with understanding. I'll wait, Samira. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. As he left, the door closed softly behind him, and Samira stood there, the weight of her decision hanging in the air. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while she felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was unclear, but it was hers to walk. The world had changed overnight for Aziz. The empire he had spent years building, carefully crafting, manipulating, and defending, had begun to crumble in ways he could never have foreseen. Samira's absence, while a blow to his pride and heart, was only a small part of the storm that was now gathering around him. Aziz sat in his office, his fingers tapping absently against the desk as his mind raced. His once unshakable confidence had begun to fray at the edges. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of the life he had built, the life that now seemed to be collapsing around him. He could feel the heat of it on his skin, the shadows closing in. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He answered it with a practiced calm, his voice cold and detached. Mr. Al-Salam, the voice on the other end said, I have some news that I think you need to hear. Aziz felt his stomach twist. He had been anticipating this moment for weeks, knowing it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Go ahead, he said, though his voice had lost its earlier sharpness. The authorities have begun investigating your financials, the voice continued. We've already received inquiries from several government agencies. There's talk of money laundering, illegal deals, and more. It's only a matter of time before they get a court order to seize your assets. Aziz sat back in his chair, his hands suddenly cold as they gripped the armrests. His heart began to race, and for the first time in years, he felt the familiar taste of fear. He had known this day was coming, the investigations, the scrutiny, the damage to his reputation. But he had hoped to hold it off, to control it just a little longer. How bad is it? He asked, his voice strained. It's bad, the voice replied. And it's not just about your business dealings. They're looking into everything. They're starting to connect the dots between you, Layla, and the people you've been associated with for years. This goes deep, Mr. Al-Salam. The silence on the other end was deafening as Aziz absorbed the weight of the words. It was happening. His past, the dark corners he had kept hidden for so long, was coming to light. The world he had so carefully constructed was beginning to fall apart. After a long pause, Aziz spoke again, his voice low and resigned. Do what you can to delay them. I need time. I need more time. But even as the words left his lips, he knew it was futile. He had no more time. The forces he had once controlled were now spiraling out of his reach. The fall from grace he had been dreading was happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As he hung up the phone, Aziz's thoughts turned to Samira. She had left him, left the life he had promised her, and now, with the walls closing in, he wondered if he had ever truly been capable of giving her anything real. The lies, the manipulation, the control, it had all seemed necessary at the time, part of a game he had played to keep power in his hands. But now, in the aftermath of it all, he realized that the game had cost him everything he cared about. In the days that followed, the fallout intensified. The media picked up on the investigation, and soon Aziz's name was plastered across newspapers and television screens. His reputation, built on years of wealth and power, crumbled with each headline, each report, each whispered conversation. He had been a king, and now he was just a man struggling to stay afloat. The pressure was too much. His assets were frozen, his accounts investigated. Legal teams were scrambling to handle the lawsuits that seemed to come in waves, and his employees began to distance themselves, fearing the fallout from being associated with him. It was all slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried to maintain control, it was no use. One evening, as Aziz sat alone in his office staring at the pile of documents in front of him, documents that could either save or destroy him, there was a knock at the door. He didn't look up. He knew who it was. Aziz, a soft voice said, and he looked up to see his lawyer, Karen, standing in the doorway. Her face was grim, the lines of stress clear on her face. What is it? He asked, his voice flat, drained of the earlier confidence. The authorities have filed for an arrest warrant, Karen said quietly. They've linked you to several offshore accounts, and now they're moving in. This isn't going to go away, Aziz. The fall is happening. Aziz's heart sank. It was happening faster than he had anticipated. He could feel the walls of his empire crumbling, the life he had known slipping away as the weight of his past mistakes caught up with him. I need to talk to Samira, Aziz said suddenly, his voice laced with desperation. I need to explain everything to her. I can't let her think I'm the same man. I have to make things right. Karen shook her head. It's too late for that, Aziz. She's already made her decision. You can't fix what's broken now. Aziz clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. No, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I can't lose her. I won't. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Samira had already walked away. The lies, the betrayal, they had shattered everything they had built together. And now, as his world came crashing down, he realized that he had lost the one person who could have saved him from himself. Hours later, Aziz stood by the window of his penthouse, looking out at the city that had once been his kingdom. The lights blinked in the distance, a symbol of the life he had once controlled. But now it all felt so far away, so unattainable. His empire was crumbling, his reputation was in tatters, and Samira was gone, and all that was left was the wreckage of his choices, the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. The fall of Aziz had come, and there was no way to stop it now. It had been several months since Aziz's fall. The world he had once controlled, his empire, his wealth, his power, was nothing more than rubble now. Samira, too, had been through her own journey, one that had taken her from betrayal and heartbreak to a place of strength and self-discovery. She had been cautious in her approach to healing, determined not to rush the process or force any feelings that weren't ready to surface. Samira had spent the last few months in therapy, working through the emotional toll that Aziz's lies and betrayal had left on her. She knew the road ahead wasn't easy, but she was beginning to understand that healing was a journey, one that would take time, patience, and acceptance. The pain of losing Aziz, of having her trust shattered, had left deep scars, but Samira had learned that scars were not a sign of weakness. They were reminders of survival. Her days were now filled with a quiet routine. She had stayed in her new apartment, the one she had moved into after leaving Aziz. It was small, modest, but it was hers, free from the weight of expectations, free from the lies and manipulations that had once surrounded her. It was a safe space, and it allowed her to slowly rebuild the life she had always wanted for herself. One evening, as she was sitting on her balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, she felt the weight of it all start to lift. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax, to just be. She thought about everything she had been through, about the darkness that had consumed her for so long, and how far she had come from it. The last few months had been about her, about rediscovering who she was, separate from the man she had once loved, and finding a way to trust herself again. It was then that she realized something important. Healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about learning from it, about letting the pain teach her the lessons she needed to grow. And through all the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the lies, Samira had grown. She had become someone stronger, someone more aware of her own worth and power. Aziz's name had faded from her thoughts, his shadow no longer looming over her. He was no longer a part of her life, and she had made peace with that. She had once believed that her happiness was tied to him, but now she saw how mistaken she had been. Happiness was something she could find within herself. Still, there were moments when she thought of him. She couldn't help it. He had been such a huge part of her life. And in those moments when his memory surfaced, she reminded herself of the hard truth. She had given him everything, and he had betrayed her in ways that were impossible to undo. The man she had loved was a stranger now, and the world he had drawn her into was not a place she could return to. Samira closed her eyes, feeling the cool breeze on her face. She had made the right choice for herself. She could never go back to the way things were, and she no longer wanted to. What she wanted now was peace, independence, and the chance to rebuild her life without the weight of a past that had been filled with lies. But there was something else, something that had been quietly growing inside her, something that had begun to change her perspective. The thought of forgiveness, of truly forgiving Aziz, had started to surface. Not for him, but for herself. Forgiveness didn't mean going back to him, didn't mean forgetting what had happened. It meant letting go of the anger and the resentment that had been weighing her down for so long. It meant freeing herself from the past so she could move forward. She thought about the last conversation she had with Aziz. She had made it clear that she couldn't trust him again, that she couldn't forgive him for the things he had done. But what she hadn't said, what she hadn't been ready to admit to herself, was that she needed to forgive him, not because he deserved it, but because she needed to let go of the bitterness that had been eating away at her. Aziz had made his mistakes, and she had made hers. But Samira now understood that forgiveness wasn't about condoning someone's actions. It was about finding peace within herself, about releasing the grip of anger and allowing herself to heal. As she sat there, the quiet of the evening surrounding her, Samira made a decision. She didn't need Aziz in her life anymore. What she needed was to keep growing, to keep moving forward. She would not let his actions define her. She would not let the past hold her hostage. The future was hers to shape, and she would shape it on her own terms. In the days that followed, Samira continued to work on herself. She focused on her career, poured herself into her work, and surrounded herself with people who supported her. She made new friends, deepened the connection she already had, and began to truly embrace the life she had once dreamed of. One morning she received a letter. It was from Aziz. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw his name on the envelope. Her first instinct was to throw it away, to erase him completely from her life. But then she stopped herself. She opened the letter slowly, her hands trembling. "Samira," the letter began, "I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect anything from you. But I need you to know that I am truly sorry for everything. I was wrong in so many ways. I've spent my time reflecting on everything I did, and I realize now that I lost the one person who meant the most to me. I can never make it right, but I want you to know that I'm working to be a better man, a better version of myself, not for you, but for me. For the first time, I'm trying to fix the broken parts of who I am, and maybe, in some way, that will help me find redemption. But no matter what, I will always be grateful for what we had. You taught me more than I ever realized. Thank you for being who you were to me." Samira read the letter through, her emotions mixed. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel pain. She just felt peace. She folded the letter and placed it on the table. She didn't need to respond. She had already made her peace with the past, and now she could finally move forward. Samira stood up, walking to the window, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She had faced her fears, healed her wounds, and had grown into someone stronger, someone capable of forgiveness, not for others, but for herself. And with that, she closed the door to the past for good. Samira stood at the edge of the balcony, the morning sunlight streaming through the glass doors, bathing the room in a warm glow. It had been a year since she had left Aziz, a year since she had decided to take control of her own life, to break free from the web of lies and betrayal that had once suffocated her. A year of healing, of growing stronger, and of rediscovering who she was without the shadow of the past looming over her. And now she stood here, on the verge of a new chapter in her life. She had spent the past few months focusing on herself, on her career, her personal growth, and her own happiness. And now, she had reached a point where she no longer felt the sting of the past. The scars, though still present, had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of peace and acceptance. She had forgiven herself for the mistakes she had made, for the choices that had led her down a path of pain, and in doing so, she had found the freedom to move forward. Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from Lena, her closest friend. "How about a celebration dinner tonight? We've both earned it, don't you think?" Samira smiled as she typed a quick reply. "Absolutely. I'm ready." It was moments like this that reminded her of how far she had come. A year ago, she had been broken, unsure of herself, unsure of her future. But now, she was standing on solid ground with a sense of purpose and direction. She had rebuilt her life, piece by piece. And now, the future was wide open to her. The thought of Aziz crossed her mind, as it often did. He had reached out to her once more, apologizing for the mistakes of the past, for the betrayal and the hurt. But Samira had made it clear that she had moved on. He was part of her past, a chapter that she would always remember, but one that she had no intention of revisiting. She had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because she had needed to let go. Holding on to the anger and pain would only hold her back, and she wasn't going to let him, nor the past, define her anymore. She had taken everything she could from the relationship, strength, lessons, and an understanding of what she truly wanted. She had learned how to trust again, but this time, it was in herself. She had learned that love wasn't about sacrifice or compromise at the expense of her own happiness. It was about partnership, respect, and equality. It was about giving and receiving in a way that felt whole, that didn't diminish her sense of self. As Samira stood in the sunlight, she realized something profound. She didn't need anyone to complete her. She was complete on her own. She had learned to be her own support, her own strength. The love she sought wasn't something she could expect from another person. It was something she had to find within herself first. And in doing so, she had found a happiness she had never thought possible. Her thoughts shifted to the future. The career that she had worked so hard for was beginning to take off. She had been offered a promotion at her firm, a leadership position that she had worked tirelessly for. It was more than just a step up in her career. It was a symbol of the growth she had achieved. She had built her professional life from the ground up, and now she was being recognized for her hard work and dedication. The future was starting to look bright in ways she had never imagined. And there were other things on the horizon too. She had begun to form new connections, new friendships, and even the possibility of love was no longer a distant dream. She wasn't rushing anything. She wasn't looking for someone to fix her. But she was open to the idea of sharing her life with someone who truly valued her. But for now, she was content. She was focused on her own growth, her own journey, and the possibilities that lay ahead. As she got dressed for the dinner with Lena, Samira felt a lightness in her chest, an excitement for the future. She was no longer weighed down by the shadows of the past. She was ready for whatever came next, confident in her ability to face it. Life was no longer something she feared or fought against. It was something she embraced, knowing that she had the power to shape it into whatever she wanted it to be. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her dress, and smiled at the reflection that smiled back at her. The woman staring back at her was no longer the fragile, uncertain woman who had once believed in the fairy tale. She was strong, self-assured, and free. And as she walked out the door to meet her friend, she knew deep in her heart that the best was yet to come. The future was bright,